Alright, congrats guys, you made it. The final part of the Core Maths series. Hope you've watched part 1 through 6 also and you didn't cheat. But anyway, welcome to part 7 of the Core Maths series, the final part. This is going to be an introduction to optimal or GTO play in poker. This is not going to be the full version of how to make GTO approximations when formulating our poker strategy. This is going to be the intro version. The longer version is going to be included as part of the postgraduate course. This video is especially designed for those who are beginners in the field of making game theory approximations regarding our poker strategy. So this is a beginner version of what GTO is in poker. This is what we're going to be looking at in this video. What is GTO/optimal play? We're going to talk about optimal aggression. We'll talk about optimal aggression on earlier streets. Now, why specifically earlier streets? Because typically in poker, the earlier the street we're on, the more complex the theory is surrounding that situation. So the easiest situations to solve for, assuming ranges are known, is the river. Things get harder on the turn, even harder on the flop. Ironically, some of the hardest spots to solve for, some of the last spots we'll ever solve, are the pre-flop situations in No Limit Hold'em. So essentially we're going to start in this video by looking at theory based on river decisions. Then we're going to talk about how that theory changes and gets more complex on the earlier streets. So we'll talk about using theory to generate strategies when we are the aggressor. We'll also use theory to generate strategies as the defender. So we'll talk about optimal defense. We'll also talk about optimal defense on earlier streets. We're then going to summarize everything to make sure you don't misconstrue any of the advice you've been given in this video. Because while understanding of game theory optimal play is a very powerful thing, it's also probably one of the leading causes of spew in players who have understood some of the concepts but aren't seeing the bigger picture. So understand that this is a theory-based video. I don't recommend you try and implement anything immediately into your game as a result of watching this video, but it's going to give you an introduction to the underlying language of poker mathematics. So let's start with this question: what is GTO? GTO stands for Game Theory Optimal, and game theory is a branch of mathematics which we can use to analyze various poker strategies. If you look up the dictionary definition of game theory, when translated, that definition essentially means the mathematics of decision making. Game theory is a branch of maths that helps us to make decisions given certain variables. So it applies almost directly to the game of poker, because poker is essentially a game about making decisions. So the end goal of applying game theory to poker is that it's possible to develop a solution to the game of poker. And that solution involves having a completely unexploitable strategy once it's discovered. In other words, there's nothing that our opponents will be able to do against an optimal strategy to damage our win rate. In fact, a perfect solution to poker guarantees a minimum win rate. The only time we can really break even with such a strategy is if our opponent is also playing a game theory optimal style of poker. But if he's not, then his mistakes are going to make that GTO style money. It's going to be profitable for the GTO play. He's going to benefit from the mistakes his opponent's making. Now there is one potential problem with this, in that any time we are playing an unexploitable strategy ourselves, it means that we're also not making adjustments in our strategy to exploit our opponents. So while understanding the solution to poker is a theoretical goal of players, it's not necessarily a strategy that's going to generate the maximum win rate. As will always be the case in poker for a very long time, the way we're going to make the most money is by following an exploitative strategy. We want to find out what our opponents are doing wrong and adjust our strategy to exploit that. Having said that, it can still help us to generate an understanding regarding the theory behind optimal poker strategy. It can help us to make improvements in our own game. It can also help us to analyze leaks in our opponent's game which we may be able to exploit. In terms of developing an optimal solution to the game of poker, so far no one's done it. In fact, no one's really even come close. Although there were some claims a little while back from a university that they had actually solved the game of fixed limit heads up hold'em. Now that's very simple game relative to no limit hold'em, and even the best computer engines are still a long way from solving the game of no limit hold'em. Besides, the other interesting thing about this is that even if we were to get our hands on the game theory optimal solution to poker, it would be so complex that we probably would not be able to use it anyway. One of the reasons why this is the case is that optimal play involves a large amount of highly complex mix strategies. A mix strategy is where we take different lines with the same holding with a certain frequency. For example, an optimal frequency, let's say we're on the flop, it would take certain hands and say that we should be raising them with some frequency, calling them with some frequency, and folding them with some frequency, depending on the specific hand, of course. So the solution is very complex. It involves taking actions at exactly the right frequency over a long period of time. So even if we had that solution on our desk, a human would not be able to implement that solution. Only a robot would be able to implement that at this stage. So while it's something that players are eagerly pursuing, it's something that ultimately is not that useful in terms of generating the highest possible win rate, and that even if we found the solution, we wouldn't be able to use it anyway. As such, it's safe to say that no one is currently playing a game theory optimal solution to the game of poker. Now, for a long time now, players have been saying that they are GTO players. Even if you go back 5-10 years ago and watch some of the videos from the professional players at that time, you'll get clips of players saying that they don't really play exploitative, they play a GTO version of poker. Well, although they say that, and the people watching them probably think that they have the entire game of poker figured out, the truth is that they didn't. What they really mean is that they are using GTO approximations to augment their decision process at the table. In other words, they are applying game theory to their strategy to improve the quality of that strategy. But when someone says they play GTO, that absolutely does not imply that they're following some kind of solution to the game of no limit hold'em, because no one knows what the solution is to the game at this stage. But for a long time, players have understood that even though our end goal is to play exploitative poker, having an understanding of game theory principles and applying them to our strategic outlook can help us to become a better poker player. So with that in mind, let's begin by looking at some situations. I'm going to start off with optimal play as the aggressor. What we're going to be doing is using GTO techniques to construct a balanced betting range on the river. Now, what do we mean by balanced? Well, assuming we're dealing with a polarized range here, which is very common, let's imagine we are the aggressor. We bet the flop, we bet the turn, we bet the river. By this point in the hand, it's usually going to be correct to refer to our range as polarized. It doesn't make sense to make big bets across multiple streets with a mid-strength hand. Either we have something very strong, or we have something which is perhaps a semi-bluff on the earlier streets and is now busted by the river. But any medium strength hand we're probably going to be checking on the river, not using it as a big bet. So working with the premise of us having a polarized range, when we talk about balance, we're talking about the balance between the amount of bluff combinations we have and the number of value combinations that we have. So as an example, let's take this question. $100 in the middle on the river, we shove all in for $100, pot size bet. What should our bluff to value ratio be? Now this is a very commonly used example to illustrate the idea of bluff to value ratios on the river. It's important to understand that there are some very big assumptions going on in the background. Let's just define those assumptions. Number one, we have a completely polarized range relative to our opponent who has a condensed range. Translation of that is, we're betting polarized, a range of strong value hands and bluffs, and our opponent's possible defending range consists entirely of bluff catchers, where a bluff catcher is a hand that always loses to our value combos but always wins against our bluffs. Now in truth, poker is not usually that tidy, but seeing as optimal play is so complex in poker, there's a tendency towards using these overly simplified examples to help us to understand the concepts. So those are the assumptions there. Our opponent has a range of bluff catchers, our range is perfectly polarized. Our value hands always win if called, our bluffs always lose if called. Given those parameters, what should our bluff to value ratio be? It's calculated like this. Look at the pot odds offered for the caller. Imagine you're a villain for a minute. How often do you need to be good here in order to make the call? It should be a very easy question for you to answer given you've watched the first 6 parts of this series. We know that if villain were calling, he would be investing 100 into a total pot of 300. He therefore needs to be good 33% of the time in order for his river call to break even. In terms of optimal balanced aggression for the better on the river, he needs to be bluffing at a frequency that allows our opponent to be exactly good as often as our pot odds dictate. So if our opponent is getting 33% pot odds, he needs to be good 33% of the time to make the call, then it's correct for the aggressor to bluff exactly 33% of the time. That would mean 33% of the range, or exactly 1/3 of the range, is going to be bluffs. That means 66.666% of the range is going to be value hands. We can express that as a ratio of 1 bluff for every 2 value hands. 1 to 2 bluff to value ratio on the river. Now, if the aggressor on the river was to bluff less than 33% of the time, the defender could generate an exploit against this. He could say, well, I'm not getting the right pot odds anymore because this player only bluffs 30% of the time, therefore I'm going to exploit him by folding all of my bluff catches. Whereas if the aggressor were to bet 35% of the time instead of the balanced 33%, then the defender could say, well, the aggressor bluffs here way too frequently, I'm actually good 35% of the time, and I only need to be good 33% of the time. I can exploit the aggressor by calling with all of my bluff catches. It's only when the aggressor bluffs with exactly this 33.333% frequency that the defender is indifferent between calling and folding. When we talk about indifference, it's nice to demonstrate that with a little bit of maths. We're going to be employing some of the tricks we learned in part 6 of this series for calculating expectation. We're going to answer the following 2 questions. Demonstrate that if villain folds 100% of the time, his EV is 0. Now, we're not going to do any maths on that because hopefully we all realize that if someone folds, they don't win anything. Their expectation is 0 in that scenario. So without doing any maths, we'd all agree that if the defender folds, his expectation is 0. But what if he decides to call every single time against this river bet which is completely balanced, i.e. 33.33% bluffs and 66.666% value hands? Can we demonstrate that the expectation doesn't change and it remains at 0? We can just do a very straightforward EV calculation. Now, I've used fractions here instead of percentages, so I don't have to keep saying 33.3333. I can just say 1/3. That embodies the frequency a lot more accurately anyway. 1/3 times by 200. So this is the probability of our opponent winning. If we're bluffing exactly 1/3 of the time, he wins 1/3 of the time. How much does he win? He wins the 100 that's in the middle, and he also wins our $100 bet on the river. 2/3 of the time, we show up with a value hand, and if he bluff catches in this instance, he's going to lose his $100 investment. So we simply need to input these values into the EV calculation. If you're not sure how this EV calculation was derived, then I recommend you go and watch part 6 of the series. We're not going to explain this again now. One thing we should hopefully remember is that we should always multiply out the brackets first. So the first bracket, when we multiply it out, we get 66.66 recurring. And the second bracket, when we multiply that out, we get the same value, 66.666 recurring. So when we subtract one value from the other, given that both values are exactly the same, what do we get? We get 0. So basically, if villain folds every time, his expectation is 0. If he calls every time, his expectation is 0. So if the EV of him calling is 0, and the EV of him folding is 0, any combination of him calling or folding will generate 0 EV. If he calls 50% of the time and folds 50%, his EV is 0. If he calls 80% and folds 20%, his EV remains at 0. He can't do anything to change his expectation because we are following a balanced strategy. There's nothing he can do to exploit us. Of course, keep in mind that when we say his expectation is 0, that doesn't mean he's breaking even in this situation. because if there's $100 in the middle, he's probably invested a decent chunk of that. In fact, in a heads-up pot, he's probably invested about $50 into that pot. So if he walks away from the river situation with an EV of 0, it essentially means he has lost $50 for the overall hand. We want to keep in mind as well that just because there's nothing villain can do to exploit us doesn't necessarily mean that we're following the best strategy, because also there's nothing that we're doing to exploit our opponent either. For example, imagine our opponent really was folding 100% of the time when we fire the river. This is something we can exploit very easily. We can weight our river betting range 100% towards bluffs and never value bet. Or if we imagine our opponent just never folded against our river bet, then we could simply increase our expectation by avoiding ever bluffing against someone who doesn't fold. So while in this situation there's nothing our opponent can do to exploit us, by following a balanced strategy we are not doing anything to actively exploit him. So in most cases, by using this strategy, we're not going to be generating our maximum expectation. Let's move on now to optimal aggression on earlier streets. How do things change assuming that we are on the turn or the flop instead of the river? Let's imagine this model. We bet pot size on flop, turn and river. Now in most cases we're not going to be betting pot size. This doesn't have to be a realistic model. Let's just work with it because it's nice and simple. We bet pot size on each street. I'd like you to think about it this way. Imagine that we get to the flop, we have a look at our range, and we decide that 10% of the hands within our range on the flop are good enough to bet all 3 streets with for value. Now for the rest of this example, which is going to get slightly complicated compared to some of the other stuff we've done so far, for the rest of this example, we're going to think about our betting range as a function of the amount of flop combos we have. So if 10% of our holdings on the flop are good enough to fire the river as a bluff, let's now work backwards from the river. 10% of our flop range we value bet the river with. So how many bluffs do we need in order to balance that out? Well, we know that if we're following a balanced strategy with a pot size bet, we're going to be using a 1 to 2 bluff to value ratio. So if we have 10% value hands, we're going to need half of that in terms of bluffs. We need 5% bluffs. And remember that 5% is 5% of our total flop range. So this means that a total of 15% of all the hands we get to the flop with are going to be firing the river as part of this balanced strategy. Now let's go back to the turn. And here is the important concept. You see, in poker, as we've seen, when we fire the river with a balanced range, our opponent's expectation is 0. And that doesn't mean he's breaking even, it means he's losing the pot. We are effectively winning the pot every single time we bet the river with a balanced range. We're effectively winning the pot even when we have one of those 5% bluffs on the river, because our opponent's expectation is not changing against our overall range. So on the turn, given we know that that 5% of our flop range is going to go on to fire the river as part of a balanced range, we can think of that effectively as part of our value range on the turn. So on the turn, we're hence betting 15% of our overall flop range for value. Notice I've used the inverted commas there. We're going to think of this now as a value range, but we really know that actually 5% of that are going to be holdings which are technically bluffs, but we're going to be using them as part of our balanced river betting range. But we're going to think of them all as value hands right now, even though those 5% are really bluffs. So we now have 15% of our overall flop range betting the turn for quote-unquote value. Now if we have 15% value, we need to balance that out with some additional bluffs. Remember, roughly half of the amount of combos we are value betting are going to need to be used as bluffs. That means if we have 15% of our flop range for value, we need another 7.5% of our flop range for bluffs. So now, expressed as a function of all of the hands that get to the flop, we're firing 22.5% of our flop range. Now of course we know that only 10% of this range are actually legitimate value bets which are going to be firing the river for value. So we can see there's been a shift in our bluff to value ratio. because 22.5% is the amount of hands being fired, but only 10% of this range are legitimate value bets. So what's happened here is that our bluff to value ratio has moved closer to 1 to 1. 10% of this range are legitimate value bets and 12.5% are actually bluffs. Or as we mentioned, 5% of that we're thinking of as effectively being value hands, even though they are really bluffs. We can apply this logic to the flop as well. Because 22.5% of our flop range is betting the turn. Now because these hands which bet the flop, all of them go on to fire the turn, this 22.5% component of our range, we can think of all of these hands as being effective value hands, even though really only 10% of them are. So if we're going to think about 22.5% of our flop range as being effective value hands, then once again, we need to pad it out with the appropriate amount of bluffs. Once again, because we're betting pot size, we're going to divide that number by 2, 22.5, so we can get our 1 to 2 bluff to value ratio. We can see that 11.25% of our flop range should be used as a bluff, for a grand total of 33.75% of our flop range being bet. Of course, although we're thinking about all of these hands as being value hands, we know that legitimately only 10% of them are really value hands. So we're betting 33.75% of our flop range, where only 10% of these hands are actual value hands. You can see once again the bluff to value ratio has shifted. We now have over 3 bluffs for every 1 value hand we have. That's a 3 to 1 bluff to value ratio. Now try not to get too bogged down with the maths here. I understand this is a video on maths, but in some senses we don't want to get too focused on the numbers themselves. This is one of the mistakes we can make just using maths in general as poker players. What we really want to do is extrapolate what we can learn from this and how it applies to poker strategy. And the overriding concept we want to extract from this is that the earlier the street we are on, the more bluffs we should have for each value hand in our range. So on the river, we actually had more value bets than bluffs. In fact, for every 1 bluff, we had 2 value hands. Whereas once we get to the turn, it's a little bit closer to being equal there. We have maybe 1 bluff for every 1 value hand. Once we get to the flop, we actually have considerably more bluffs in our range for each 1 value combo that we have. So the earlier the street we are on in poker, the more aggressively we should bluff. It's very important to be able to extrapolate the relevant concepts from this data. And that's why here with the last bullet point here, I've written, be careful with certain assumptions. Because we could get carried away with this model, and we could use it for things that it's not really relevant for. For example, when we look at the betting frequency of 33.75% of our flop betting range, we could take that to mean that we're only supposed to be betting 33.75% of the time on the flop. But that's absolutely not the case here. This is just a model we've used to illustrate a certain concept. And one thing we'll discover when we look more deeply into game theory optimal approach to poker is we're only considering 1 bet sizing here. In fact, we're only considering 1 bet sizing plan throughout the entire hand, which involves betting pot size on each street. Not necessarily a very realistic model. In fact, good players are going to be making use of a range of different sizings on the flop, many of which are going to be considerably smaller than pot size. So we absolutely don't want to look at this model and say, oh, well now we've demonstrated that we should be betting 33.75% of the time on the flop. That's not what this model has been designed to do. In most cases, we should probably be betting significantly more aggressively than that on the flop. So it's very important we don't get carried away with the numbers here. I would also say that in most cases, because we're using the larger sizing, and the basic relationship here, by the way, is that the larger the sizing we use, the more bluffs we should have in our range. Because we've run a model here where the sizings we are using are larger than they might be on average, i.e. pot size bets, then these ratios are going to be a little bit more bluff heavy than they might be in practice. So while we're currently getting 1.2 to 1 bluff to value ratio on the turn, when we use smaller sizings for this model such as 2/3 pot, it's going to be closer to 1 to 1. On the flop, although we're getting 3.375 to 1, perhaps when we're using 2/3 pot size bet throughout the entire model, we're going to get something closer to 2 to 1 on the flop, for example. So we want to be very careful with running away with certain assumptions based on this model. We have to understand what this model is good for, and that's demonstrating that the earlier the street we're on, the more aggressively we need to bluff. Okay, now let's move on to optimal defense. Let's start with a basic question. We're on the river again. Remember, we said we're going to start off with river scenarios exclusively. We face a $100 pot size bet on the river. How often should we defend? So our opponent's shoving all in. We're the one defending now. He's betting pot size. How often should we defend? I've put again in brackets some assumptions here. Hopefully you're already familiar with the assumptions because they are the same assumptions we made when considering the model where we were the aggressor. The way this works is as follows. We answer the following question. If villain were bluffing, how often would his bluff need to succeed in order to generate automatic profit? So very simple break-even threshold question. He's investing 50% of the total pot, his $100 shove plus the $100 that's already in the middle. Therefore, the break-even point on his bluff is 50%. If his bluff works more than 50%, he's generating automatic profit. So how do we stop our opponent's bluff from working more than 50% of the time? We defend exactly 50% of the time ourselves to stop villain from generating automatic profit. Very simple calculation here, sometimes referred to as 1 minus alpha, sometimes referred to as MDF, which stands for minimum defense frequency. If we defend less than 50% of the time, our opponent's bluff will succeed more than 50% of the time. He can generate automatic profit. And if we defend more than 50% of the time, we'll actually be defending too much and our opponent can exploit us in other ways. So this one is nice and straightforward. In fact, this is usually the first thing that players learn about optimal play, is how to construct defending frequencies based on our opponent's bet sizing. But let's see how things change as we progress towards the earlier streets. So similar scenario, there's 100 in the middle, we face a $50 bet. How often do we need to defend to stop our opponent from generating automatic profit? Or how often should we defend from a theory point of view? We'll see those two questions are actually slightly different. So how often do we need to defend? Well, if we just run the basic break-even point calculation, our opponent is investing 1/3 of the pot on his bet. Therefore, if it succeeds more than 33% of the time, he's generating automatic profit. How do we stop his bet from succeeding more than 33% of the time? We defend at least 67% of the time. Unfortunately, as we start progressing towards the earlier streets, things are not quite this simple. There are a number of extremely important additional variables which can completely warp this value. In other words, if we folded exactly 33% of the time, there's a possibility that we're doing something drastically wrong depending on the situation. So what else do we have to consider when figuring out what our defending frequency might look like? One of the very important variables is range advantage. Optimal play takes into account the state of both players' ranges. Now this is a common misconception. Sometimes players think that GTO poker is playing poker without caring what our opponent's range is, whereas that's not really true. An optimal strategy is based on what both players' ranges are at any given time. So GTO play actually takes that into account. There are some situations where, coded into the optimal strategy, one player is simply going to have a stronger range than the other player. In situations where one player's range is noticeably stronger, his opponent is forced to fold more frequently against the bets from the stronger range. So let's say, for example, in a certain flop situation, the board texture just connects a lot harder with the player who is the aggressor, and he fires a continuation bet. And his opponent, just completely oblivious to the range versus range equity in this scenario, just looks at the bet sizing and says, okay, it's a half pot bet, I need to defend 67% of my range, so he folds only 33% of the time to a c-bet. Because of that range versus range equity imbalance, that player is going to get into a lot of trouble. In fact, the correct GTO response is for him to fold a lot more frequently than the MDF, the minimum defense frequency, might suggest. So this is where it goes wrong for a lot of players when they look into GTO poker for the first time. They learned this first part about figuring out roughly how often we should defend based on the size of our opponent's bet, but they don't learn any of this second part. For example, range advantage. Very, very important variable in figuring out how often we should defend. It's not like the river situation where we can just look purely at the sizing. To give another example variable, positional advantage. We know this is huge in no limit hold'em. Yet players with a rudimentary understanding of GTO poker are going to completely ignore this because they're basing everything on their opponent's bet size. They're just going to defend 67% of the time against a half pot bet. But the truth is we should defend more often when we have position. It confers a big advantage in poker. We should defend less often when it's our opponent who has the positional advantage. So we can use this when analyzing our stats, for example, in a database review. Let's take something like fold to c-bet stat. Now if your fold to c-bet stat in position and your fold to c-bet stat out of position are exactly the same, then that means you're not showing good positional awareness when you play poker. They should be different. Fold to c-bet in position should be a lot lower than fold to c-bet out of position, even if you're following a GTO approach to playing poker. Also, we've put here defense strategy, so what do we mean by that? Well, the idea is that, let's say our opponent's not all in on the flop. We have two options in terms of how we defend. We can either raise against this flop bet, or we can just call. The frequency with which we choose to either raise or call is going to have an impact on how often we need to defend overall. Because anytime we just call against our opponent's bet, he gets to see an additional card on the turn. He gets to realize additional equity. And we have to defend more frequently to compensate for this. Whereas if we're raising most of the time when we defend, our opponent doesn't get to see any free equity, so our minimum defense frequency is going to be a lot closer to the base value we've calculated purely using his bet sizing. So on a really basic level, if we just ignore all positional advantage, and if we just ignore range versus range equity advantage, let's say we really did have to defend 67% of our range against a half pot bet, that would only be true if we defended every single time by raising. If we defended primarily by calling, we'd actually have to defend more than 67% of our range to make up for the fact that our opponent is free rolling equity on the turn and river. So the result of all of this is that the minimum defense calculation can often be very misleading, especially on the earlier streets. We might think we have to defend 67% of our range, but if we have a positional disadvantage and we have a range versus range equity disadvantage, then there are situations where we should actually just be folding 75 or 80% of the time when facing c-bet from our opponent, and that's all game theory optimally correct. So in such scenarios, if we try and rigidly apply this MDF or 1 minus alpha formula here and defend 67% of our range, we're going to get destroyed on the later streets because we're simply defending too wide. So hopefully we can see how some big mistakes can be made here from just understanding the basics of GTO play and not understanding some of the deeper material. That's why I say don't try and employ this immediately into your game. Just think of this as a theory-based concept for now. The application of this theory will become more evident as you make progress in your poker career. So here's what you should be able to do after watching this video. Number one, we should be able to understand the relevance of GTO-based strategies. So we should understand that playing GTO poker allows us to potentially, sometime in the future, have a strategy which is completely unexploitable. But at the same time, this is not necessarily the best thing to do as a player because it means that we're not exploiting our opponents in any way. So we understand what GTO poker is, we should also understand why for the most part it's not going to be that helpful in terms of making money in a real world environment. Having said that, it's still useful to be aware of these GTO based concepts. We can use them to improve our game. We can also use them to spot leaks in our opponent's game, which we can exploit. Hopefully after watching this video we can understand the basics regarding optimal aggression and the basics regarding optimal defense. We should also see how this theory gets more complex as we progress backwards through the hand. The turn is more complicated than the river, and the flop is even more complicated, and pre-flop's actually the hardest street of all in terms of a theory approach to the game of poker. Finally, we hopefully understand that a little knowledge can be dangerous. There are some ways you can potentially apply this in your game. For example, you understand that you should be bluffing more frequently on the early streets and you bluff on the later streets. But don't try and run too far with these concepts before you're ready. We're going to be revisiting these concepts in a lot more detail in the postgraduate part of this course. Just think of this as an introduction. So we've raised your awareness regarding optimal play in poker. For now, those concepts are hopefully going to fly below the radar somewhat. You're gradually going to increase your awareness of the application in the game of poker, and by the time you reach a very high level at this game, you'll be able to fully break out those concepts and use them to make a lot of money. But don't make any sudden movements in your game right now in terms of your strategy. Just think of this purely as a theory-based video for the time being. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Congratulations for watching the entire Core Maths series. You definitely know the basic maths you need to crush poker, and you probably know a little bit more than that as well. I imagine after watching this, you know more than the average player regarding how the language of mathematics underscores this game that we like to play. Okay, so the journey doesn't need to end there. I look forward to catching you guys in the next module of my undergraduate course, module number 3. So in the meantime, good luck at the tables. This was Weasel for PokerWeasel.com.